Good afternoon. My name is James Burling, and I'm here to ask a question. Why is it so darn hard to find affordable quality apartment or any kind of housing? How can anyone expect to buy a nice home in many big cities or practically anywhere in California except for the middle of the desert? The answer may lie in the inexorable law of supply and demand, a law that no one has figured out how to repeal. Not Hugo Chavez, not his successor Nicolas Maduro, not even Kim Jong-un, not even Senator Bernie Sanders or the California legislature have figured out a way to undo the law of supply and demand. So we're going to explore this afternoon how much housing we need, how much we actually have, and how much we have to be building each year and why we're not building it. We also are going to focus on government solutions to government problems, such as rent control to counter housing shortages, rent control that in turn creates worse housing shortages. We're going to talk about government attempts to use new housing as cash cows for pet projects, only driving up costs further. But mostly, we're going to talk about land use restrictions and how they work to keep an increasing number of people out of decent homes. Unless we decide to start counting tents and tarps on sidewalks and under bridges as decent homes. I'm James Burling, Vice President for Legal Affairs at Pacific Legal Foundation. We're a nonprofit public interest legal foundation that takes up cool cases defending property rights and economic liberties for free. We've been doing it for over 45 years, and our goal is to get cases to the Supreme Court. So far, we've had 13 cases at the court. We've won 11, lost 2, and have 1 in the pipeline. To read about that case, Cedar Point versus California, that'll be argued next Monday at the Supreme Court. Check it out on our website, pacificlegal.org. I myself have been litigating property right cases for 37 years, and I've only just begun. Also with us is Emily Hamilton, a senior research fellow and director of the Urbanity project at Mercatus Center at George Mason University. Mercatus Center is a free market-oriented think tank that does important policy work, including work on land use, zoning, and market urbanism. Ms. Hamilton's research focuses on urban economics and land use policy. Hamilton has authored numerous academic articles and policy papers. Her writing has appeared in USA Today and the Washington Post and the Los Angeles Times. She contributes to the blog Market Urbanism, and Hamilton received her PhD in economics from George Mason University. Jeremy Talcott is an attorney with Pacific Legal Foundation, where his work focuses on strengthening protections for private property within the law. Though he has been involved in cases all across the country, and as an aside, he says it's one great advantage of working in public interest nonprofit law. You can travel all over. The majority of his caseload involves housing and property issues in California, because as you'll hear later, the situation here in California is particularly bad. He got his law degree from Chapman University in Orange County and is now returned to PLF, and is now returned there to teach PLF's Liberty Clinic, where law students get the opportunity to work on direct impact litigation, including, for example, a recent PLF challenge to housing permit denials by the California Coastal Commission. So, Jeremy, let me begin with you. What do we mean when we say there's a housing crisis? What are some of the numbers that back that claim up?
Well, I think the first thing I would say is that although we just call it a housing crisis, there's really multiple issues that are going on in California, some of which are, for example, the homelessness. California has the nation's worst homelessness problem right now, more homeless individuals than any other state, around 150,000 individuals. On top of that, we have a problem or a crisis of housing costs. And what that looks like is how much, what percentage of an individual's income are they required to spend on the housing, on their housing. And here, some of the numbers that I would say on that, about 2.5 million households in California spend more than 30% of their income just on housing. And that's what we would call, especially within the poverty line, that's a substantial portion of, and constitutes kind of a strain on the individual. But we also have about 1.5 million renters that are spending over 50% of their income on housing specifically. And again, that is a substantial amount for individuals across the board. But even when we go beyond individuals that are below the poverty line, at every income range in California, we are spending more, a larger percentage of our income on housing than the national average.
So Jeremy, what are some of the numbers you talk about? Where there's this legislative analyst office, and they've come up with some rather stark numbers. What are those numbers?
Yeah. So I mean, I'd say some of the numbers that are important. And again, all of this, when we talk about how come we're spending so much, a lot of it stems from the same base problem, which is we are simply not building enough housing to meet the demand. And what that looks like year over year is that just to keep up with the population growth within California, California needs to build somewhere between about 200 and 250,000 homes each year. And we're lucky if we're reaching even half that on a good year right now. And especially with years such as just the last couple of years, we're not getting anywhere close. There simply aren't enough projects being started. And that's coupled then with the cost of building each unit. And the cost to build a unit tends to be more expensive here in California than anywhere else. So even the units that are getting built are extremely expensive. And, again, just to put that into some numbers and to look how this has grown even worse, while we really consider this a crisis over the last 50 years, the average cost of a home in California has gone from about costing 3 times average household income to causing 7 times average household income. So it's not just numbers of inflation over time. It is substantially more expensive to either buy or rent in California than it was in the past.
So in the old days, you figured once you graduate from college, in several years, you can accumulate enough nest egg to get a down payment and get a starter home. But that doesn't seem to be the case anymore. There seems to be a lot of blowback as a result of that. A lot of people are getting a little frustrated and a little disgusted. So Emily, I want to turn to you. We all know what NIMBY means, not in my backyard. But what is this thing that we hear about now lately called Yinbi movement, the Yinbi movement? What does that mean? And how does that relate to this field of market urbanism that you're so much involved in?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Jim, and thanks to everyone who's joining us this afternoon. The Yinbi movement, the first Yinbi organization, was actually founded in Canada, but in the US, it's really taken off in California, due in large part to the stats that Jeremy covered. It's the state with the worst affordable housing problem in the country. And so as a result, a lot of individuals, excuse me, and households are struggling to afford housing, not just the lowest income individuals and households, but even upper middle class households are feeling the pain of high housing costs in markets like San Francisco or Los Angeles. So that's given fuel to this yes in my backyard movement, to counter some of the political opposition to new and lower cost housing construction. Market Urbanism was a website, is a website that was founded by Adam Hengels, who I work with there. And the idea behind the term is that urbanists have a lot to learn from free market oriented folks on how markets can deliver housing at prices that is affordable to people of a wide range of incomes and neighborhoods and cities that people want to live in. And also that historically, land use regulations have been an issue that's been undercovered by market-oriented types, even though they're a huge intervention in policy and in the economy. There's a lot that libertarians or other market-oriented individuals can learn from urbanists about what makes cities work and under what conditions they work best.
So you talk about land use restrictions, and let's turn to zoning because I know you've done work on zoning, but let me preface this by a little bit because oftentimes when I talk to people in a suburban neighborhood, they say, yeah, we definitely have to build more housing, but not here. Because if you build it here, there's going to be a problem. So how does these zoning laws prevent new home building?
Yes, zoning rules are on the books of almost every developed part of the country. And two of the most important zoning rules are single family zoning, which typically means that only one housing unit can be built on a lot, and it has to be separated on all of its sides by a green open space, not touching any other housing units around it, and minimum lot size requirements that mean that each of those detached single family houses have to sit on a yard of a certain size. So a lot of people, for very understandable reasons, like their neighborhoods of any type the way that they are now. They moved there for a reason. But when this small c conservative attitude is applied to neighborhood after neighborhood and locality after locality, we run into the situation we have today, where entire regions of the country become very expensive, and living there poses huge burdens from an affordability perspective on residents who have lived there for a long time or residents who want to move there in search of their own best opportunities.
Yeah, so we talk about zoning. Are there other sort of restrictions that have an impact on the ability to build new homes?
There are rules that often are a little bit distinct from zoning, but may or may not be found in a zoning ordinance.
Mhm.
Rules like historic preservation that prevent neighborhoods from changing over time, parking requirements that can be very expensive to provide in places where land is expensive. And then there's also the approval process. So there are the zoning rules on the books, and then all of these other rules that proposed developments have to comply with in order to get approved. Those can include long delays and, excuse me, subjective um, and uncertain design review processes, as well as sometimes large fees that developers have to pay to offset real or alleged impacts of their development.
Okay. And before I turn back to Jeremy, you also have written about the missing middle. What do we mean by the missing middle in housing?
Missing middle housing refers to anything that's of a density in between detached single family housing and a large apartment building. So it could be a single family house that also has a backyard cottage. It
Mhm.
could be a townhouse that's attached to its neighbors, or it could be something like a fourplex where there are four smaller units in a structure that looks something like a single family house from the outside.
So
Missing middle.
a way to get more density in a particular area, to have more people live in an area, but at the same time not forcing people to live in a big high rise if they don't want to do that, or force them to be in a single family home because a single family home with a large lot might not be for everybody. People should have a choice, right?
Exactly. And missing middle has really been zoned out in a lot of instances.
Hmm. Jeremy, let me turn to you. How do the environmental laws stop housing? And is it true that it's nearly impossible to build nowadays in large swaths of California? And let me preface that question though by asking by a little quote from a 1985 book called The Zoning Game Revisited. And in this book, there's a quote where Professor Babcock and Seaman say, California has always been notorious for being the first jurisdiction to sustain extreme municipal regulations. Practitioners, that is, lawyers in other states, have joked about why a developer would sue a California community when it would be cost a lot less and save much time if he simply slit his throat. That shows a frustration of trying to develop in California. So, Jeremy, what's going on with California laws that stop development?
Well, as Emily mentioned, there's issues like direct costs. that are placed on housing. But California also has quite a few environmental laws, such as the California Environmental Quality Act. And these types of laws often can impose other outside costs on the permit process. And the way I would kind of give an example of that, or is if you have a property that otherwise would be able to be developed, but someone alleges that there might be an environmental impact caused by that, you may have to do an environmental impact report. And so at the request, perhaps, either of local government, this could be something that they demand initially. You're going to need to do this report. A third party could step in and allege the environmental impacts, and then you have to create this report. But
so Jeremy, wait a second. What's wrong with that? What, an environmental report? You're going to build a home, a couple homes. Is what, 10, 15 pages to lay out what's there and what you're going to do to it? What's the big deal?
Well, really the issue here is all of those reports add cost, and often those reports can cost into the tens, or at times over six figures to prepare these various reports. And
of course, I was being facetious because I've never seen a 10-page environmental impact report that would ever pass muster in any court. We're talking hundreds of pages. Oftentimes, we're talking you have to hire your consultants, your biologists, your geologists, your archaeologists, your anthropologists, all your apologists whatsoever to do this report. And then the other side is going to nitpick it, right? They're going to go line by line and say, no, there are not 16 little finches in this area per square mile. There are 17. So you have to rewrite the report, and the court will say, yeah, go ahead, rewrite the report. And you start all over again. Isn't that the way it really works, Jeremy?
That's precisely it. Oftentimes, it's not just one report. Even if it is, again, each one of these reports is adding expense. And, one of the other points to just to mention is that even if the law itself was passed with pure intentions as to environmental preservation, it's not always so that every person that takes advantage of that law is doing so with the same pure intentions at heart. And so
give me an example of an impure example of an environmental law being used.
Sure. Well, one example that's been pretty famous out of the last couple of years is there's a community group in San Francisco that has opposed almost every development that's going into a group. And one famous one was a laundromat that the owner wished to redevelop, and in fact, take a coin-operated laundromat and turn it into a 75-unit, 6-story building. So, we're talking about adding 75 units, no loss of units, no displacement of tenants, 75 additional units in San Francisco, where housing is desperately needed and wanted. And yet, this was a process that went on for years with the community group opposing at every step. They required I think it was a 137-page report, an example of one report as to the historical, if any, value of the laundromat itself. And it turned out there wasn't. But again, that alone was tens of thousands of dollars to produce. And switching to the environmental laws, ultimately, the city council voted unanimously, 11-0, to further delay this project so that a study could be done as to the impact of shadows on a neighboring schoolyard by the building, and environmental laws were the justification for that. So again, I don't think anyone at the time that the California Environmental Quality Act was passed thought that we were ultimately going to be preserving or protecting against potential shadows cast by a building and the impact that might have on any neighboring residents that wanted to play on the swing set.
Yeah, and my favorite example along those lines also comes from San Francisco, where somebody wanted to build, Habitat for Humanity was trying to build some homes. And a neighbor who happened to be a lawyer was upset because it was going to impact the view from his little office complex that he had. He had a little Victorian mansion that was a nice office, and he didn't want the view to be affected. by Habitat for Humanity Housing. So he sued under the California Environmental Quality Act. And he argued there were going to be traffic impacts and things like that. And he slowed down the project. Ultimately, his partners were embarrassed so much that they decided to drop the objections. But that's the sort of thing that closes buildings down in San Francisco and a lot of other cities, cities that Emily has called closed cities. So Emily, when you talk about closed cities and their impact on housing affordability, what do you mean when you say a city is closed? People can still move there, right?
They can. My colleague Kevin Erdman coined the term closed access cities, and this refers to the parts of the country where it's really difficult to build new housing in response to increases in demand for housing, both because of the zoning rules on the books and because of the difficult approval process that we've been talking about. And so people can still move into those cities, but what happens is that when people do move in, it often puts so much upward pressure on rents in that region that other people have to move out. And one incredible statistic is that more housing for New Yorkers has been built in Florida in recent years than in New York. So as residents are moving into New York City and the surrounding region, they are crowding into the housing stock that's available there. But then other residents, likely lower income residents on average, are moving out of the state to places where they have fewer social ties and family connections and have to look for a new job, but where housing is more affordable and their quality of life can overall be higher elsewhere.
Yeah, it's a tremendous impediment to try to live in one of these cities, whereas Jeremy put it, you're 7 times more costly than your income. Then the ratio is just that's astonishing. So what makes a city closed? And along those lines, how can we open them up again?
Well, it's a combination of that approval process as well as the zoning rules. So it requires a combination of upzoning, so allowing more multifamily housing of all types, denser single family housing on smaller lots than what current rules allow, and then also just making it much faster, a clearer, more certain process, and easier for developers to get their proposed projects approved and built so that we don't have years long approval processes like what we currently see in San Francisco for new housing to get built.
Right. So you talk about New York, San Francisco being closed cities, but you mentioned a minute ago that this has an adverse impact on lower income people who are most likely to be moving out. Uh, isn't the progressive movement, though, of caring for lower income people and making sure they have affordable housing, is it not working in these closed cities? I mean, I thought that was the whole point of having subsidies and that kind of thing, but they're still moving out. Why would that be?
Yes, ironically, some of the most expensive, most closed access parts of the country are also places that people generally think of as being very progressive parts of the country, even though they have these rules that make it very difficult for low income residents to live there comfortably. Zoning rules have the effect of raising the cost of housing, and often that's the exact intent that they were implemented with. Minimum unit size requirements or minimum lot size requirements were often passed with the policymakers saying, these rules are so great, they're going to make it impossible for poor people to live in our jurisdiction. And often sentiments around policy that's intended to shut out low-income people have changed, but the rules have not, and they're often today justified by totally different reasoning, but they continue to have the effects of raising the cost of housing and shutting out low-income people.
Yeah, one of my favorite examples along those lines comes from Mount Laurel Township in New Jersey, where there were a series of cases at the New Jersey Supreme Court about the town of Mount Laurel that had zoning specifically designed to keep poor people out. And the example was that there was a group of community members who were African American, who had their ancestors had lived in this community for several centuries, since the 1700s. And they were trying to build a little affordable housing project as part of the church work that they were doing. And they were running up against the zoning issues. And one of the city commissioners came to the meeting at the church one, hot October morning, and looked at them straight in the eye and said, look, if you people cannot afford to live here anymore, you're just going to have to move. And that set off an entire movement. So that attitude toward we only want nice people that look like us living in this community was the impetus for a lot of the zoning. And until we recognize the sordid history behind some of our zoning laws, I think it's going to be difficult to correct those, especially in progressive areas. Another example is you look in my neighborhood in the middle of suburbia in California. People don't want new housing. They like the fact that all their investment is in their home. And if you build enough housing that the prices will become to go down, your investment's going to go down. So you're up against some serious concerns. And Emily, let me ask you just one more question before I turn back to Jeremy about these closed cities. I can understand why a city like San Francisco or New York City would be closed, because geographically, there ain't much you can do. You can't build out into the Hudson River, and you can't build out into the San Francisco Bay. Well, they used to do that, but you can't dredge and fill the bay anymore. So, but why are some other cities, say like Portland, closed? There's lots of land in all directions around Portland. Why would they be a closed city?
Yeah, Portland has the country's most famous urban growth boundary, which is a rule that says that blocks off land in some of the counties surrounding Portland for either open space or agricultural development exclusively. And when you look at land prices inside and outside of that urban growth boundary, unsurprisingly, land is much more expensive in the area within that boundary because it can actually be developed. And that in turn gets passed on to home buyers and renters with higher prices. And Portland and surrounding localities, in addition to this growth boundary, also have all kinds of restrictions on denser housing, multifamily housing, or small lot, single family housing of all types. So you have rules on the one hand preventing densification and allowing more people to live within the boundary easily. And then on the other hand, you have this boundary that's preventing outward development. So it's really a case of policy constraining development from all sides.
Yeah, so development gets constrained, supply is limited, prices go up. But one solution to high prices for housing is government control. And let me talk about rent control and ask Jeremy about this. Rent control can certainly keep rents low. And so that does seem to be a solution that a lot of progressives are talking about increasingly across the United States. We have it in New York City, of course, we have it in California cities, and a scattering of some other places, but not a lot of places. Now, there is some history of rent control in the old days, and I have a couple quotes that I love to give, and you can find one of them in this book here, Rent Control's Myths and Realities. And there's an economist named Asser Lindbeck who wrote that in many cases, rent control appears to be the most efficient technique so far of knowing to destroy cities, except for bombing. And so in this book, there are a series of photographs that you can see of cities that are either bombed or have been subject to rent control. And the question is which is which? And then you have to go to the back to look because you can't tell. The one I just showed you is Brooklyn, which had been destroyed by this very, very draconian rent control that was pretty much done away with, but reinstituted in 2019. So we're going to see what happens there. And the second quote I have is that this is from the foreign minister of Vietnam, who in 1989 wrote that the Americans couldn't destroy Hanoi, but we have destroyed our city by very low rents. We realized it was stupid and that we must change policy. So, Jeremy, with a new push for rent control across the nation, are things any different today? why should we expect a different result?
And Jim, I'll add one quote on to yours, which is, just to say this is not something that is solely the view of, say right-wing economists or only free market economists. So, Paul Krugman back in 2000 said that rent control is among the best understood issue in all of economics, and at least among economists, one of the least controversial.
Right. A poll of economists a few years ago, 98% of economists from all across the political spectrum said rent control doesn't work.
Yes. And, not only, again, I think, as you said, well, it works for a very small subset of people where their rents are kept artificially low. But the side effects of keeping rents low are fairly predictable. And what we see is, if the building that you have built, if the rents are kept artificially low to where you can't recover properly the amount that is worth, you are not going to put additional investment into it. So the existing apartments, we see them decay, and that goes to the pictures that you saw of buildings, that look essentially bombed out. On top of that, if you know that you will not be able to obtain a return on your investment, it's very unlikely that you're going to invest a bunch of your own money into a building. So on top of that, rent control is uniquely effective at preventing the development of additional units that are badly needed. So if you could invest, say $5 million into a building that will then have a very minimal return on investment, artificially so because of the city, or you could go invest it in a stock market or in game stonks or whatever is the way to make a bunch of money at the moment, you're going to go for that instead. And so on top of destroying the stock that exists, you disincentivize any new development, and any apartments that are not rent controlled become tremendously, well, the rent controlled ones are also obviously desirable, but because units are sparse, the cost of non-controlled units go up substantially. So you end up having the very artificially low units that are hard to come by, and then the units that do exist that are not controlled are extremely expensive and out of reach for your average, potentially for your average individual.
Right. And you have to have a huge bureaucratic apparatus to control this, because if you live in a rent controlled apartment and you want to move, and it's going to be rent controlled after you leave, you can try to get the new tenant to pay you some key money to move in. So there's that kind of corruption going on. If you look at the history of rent control in New York City, when rent control was removed after World War I, building went up through the roof. People were building more and more homes. Rent control reimposed. New construction stopped again. History repeats itself over and over again. So as attractive as rent control might be, and especially say to some students who might be watching this, living in rent controlled New York City, it's nice for a while, but in the long run, it makes cities unlivable and overly expensive because you just aren't going to have enough new housing built. So I'm going to ask people who are watching this, if you have any questions, put them in the question box and we'll try to get to them. I encourage you to do that. But I want to turn to Emily just for a second, because she's written a little bit about some of the things that the new administration has promised to do to alleviate the housing supply. And so what are things that it's talking about that could help, and what are some of the things it's talking about that might hurt?
Yeah, the Biden administration, as well as other recent both Republican and Democratic administrations, have expressed real concern about housing affordability problems and the desire to do something about it. The politics of housing tend to get better the higher level of government that we're talking about. So if we're talking about a little local neighborhood, there might be a lot of NIMBYism, and yes, we need more housing, but somewhere else. But as we get to the state or federal level, policymakers recognize that this is a serious problem that needs real reform in the most expensive parts of the country. The Biden administration has proposed using some federal grants as a carrot or stick, whichever way you want to look at it, to encourage localities to reform their zoning restrictions and permitting approval processes. The federal government's limited really to that approach in how much it can affect local zoning reform. It's just got this funding that it can use to try to incentivize change at the local level. And unfortunately, those funds are generally really important to lower income localities relative to higher income localities. So they're not necessarily going to be a super effective tool in some of the highest income, most closed access localities in the country. Nonetheless, I think it's certainly worth trying. And the process of identifying which localities would be ineligible for these grants could be a good opportunity for the administration to name and shame the Cupertinos or the Palo Altos that are just doing a terrible job of letting people access the opportunities that they offer.
Now, when you talk about having an impact on local control, when the Obama administration tried that, there was a lot of pushback in places like Westchester County, New York. So how do you deal with that sentiment?
Well, in my view, there are certainly concerns about the entanglement of funding at the federal and local level, with states and localities being increasingly dependent on federal funds for paying for some of their basic services. But I don't think that putting strings on those funds is necessarily an extra concern. If those funds are going to be in place, and there's a widely agreed upon bipartisan consensus that there's a role for the federal government to encourage reforms that will promote affordability, I think it's worth trying. Um, yeah.
Are there things that you've been hearing that the new administration may be considering that could be harmful to the housing supply?
Yes, and this is another bipartisan issue where there tends to be agreement across the political spectrum that it's always good to offer more subsidies to home ownership, and that carries through to the Biden plan, which suggests offering new tax incentives for first-time home buyers. Now, the problem with these subsidies is that when these subsidies meet very constrained locations, the closed access parts of the country where it's really difficult to build more housing, they're just going to cause further increases in price. And those costs are going to be borne by renters, particularly the lowest income renters. And we see that it tends to be homeowners who are the political force behind NIMBYism and behind maintaining exclusionary zoning rules in the first place. So I think it's really unlikely that further subsidies to home ownership are ultimately the way to solve housing affordability problems.
Yeah, I kind of agree. I mean, you can have all the subsidies in the world, but if it's still impossible to build homes in an area, then those subsidies aren't going to go very far. They just might subsidize the already high costs and make high costs higher.
Right.
Subsidies usually have a perverse impact that way. Um, so, Jeremy, I want to turn to you again and talk about these so-called exactions, where government forces developers to pay huge sums of money to get building permits. And we see that there are exactions for traffic impact, for police services, even subsidies imposed on new development to subsidize low-income housing. So, Jeremy, how do these altogether affect housing affordability?
Well, again, those are what we would kind of consider the direct costs when we're talking about difficulties in building houses in California, as opposed to some of the indirect costs like delays that have been discussed. But with those direct costs, exactly like you said, it's generally at least the theory is that new development will impact the city in some way. whether it's an increased burden on the, say, sewer system or police services, fire services, or the like. And so the city then seeks to offset those theoretical burdens by putting an impact fee on the various stages of the permit. And in California, those permit fees are often tremendously high. Again, sticking with our theme, they tend to be higher than most other places in the country, and generally adds up to tens of thousands of dollars on top of the cost of development. So naturally, the more cost that you impose on the developer in order to build, the more that the final unit or house, whether it's single or multifamily development, will end up being. And again, that tends to be tens of thousands of dollars of impact, whether you're looking at it per home or per unit in a multifamily unit.
And when you add all these fees up, some communities in California, it's over $100,000 for fees. Then you have to build a solar roof, which will cost $10,000 additional dollars, so on and so forth. Jeremy, are there constitutional limitations on what cities can charge their developer ATMs?
Yes. So thankfully, there are some constitutional limits, and that is one of the avenues that specifically PLF has attempted to rein in these kind of local government abuses. And, it comes down to some of PLF's important work before the Supreme Court. The first case that really talked about this was Nolan against California Coastal Commission. And that was where the Supreme Court established that there has to be a nexus. So it's not enough for government to simply say, this is an impact fee for something. Government has to actually show a substantial nexus between a harm caused by the development and the fee that they are imposing. So again, if you're saying this, we're going to take a sewer fee, it better be a home that is actually going to be hooked up to the sewer. Otherwise, it wouldn't be impacting in that way. So the government is limited in that way. They have to establish the nexus. And then some later cases, specifically Dolan against City of Tigard is a case that came along and said, on top of that, it has to be proportional. So these are some important constitutional limitations. Again, you can't say it's $100,000 because you're going to impact our sewer. You have to at least make some findings as the local government that show it will have this percentage of impact on our system. Our system costs this much, therefore we find that this is the amount we can charge each house. And again, this is a constitutional limitation under the Fifth Amendment. So if the local governments attempt to demand too much, they are essentially taking property in violation of the Fifth Amendment. And I will just note that in that opinion, since we've gone with quite a few quotes, one excellent quote from the Nolan case was likening the exactions pre-Nolan to an out-and-out plan of extortion. So before this, local governments had really found a cash cow that they could bilk. People had property, they badly wanted to use it, and the governments were just taking as much as they could. And so thankfully that has been restrained. That's doctrines that we still go after, and where we look for opportunities where the government either can't show a link or the link is very tenuous. And I think one example of that really comes down to the affordable housing fees, because as we just mentioned, imposing fees on a unit raises the cost of a unit. So it is very difficult to square an impact fee for affordable housing on a unit. And of course, again, just also on theme, supply and demand here, building new units adds supply, which lowers costs and helps meet demand. So it's very tenuous to try and draw this connection.
Yeah. And I see one of the watchers here asked a question about, how do I convince my friends in the left of this problem when they see rent control as a moral good? And I'll take the first stab at that. And it may be a moral good. It is kind of like if you have somebody who's cold and shivering outside, you say, oh, well, this person needs some hot soup. So you pour the hot soup over on top of them. They feel good for a few minutes, But all of a sudden, it's going to start getting very cold and even worse than it was before because you're drenched with this soup. So rent control, by preventing the construction of new units, ultimately leads to fewer houses being built, ultimately leads to people having to find alternative housing. And if they can't double or triple up with their friends and neighbors and couch surf, they end up on the streets. So my response is that rent control might seem good in the short term, but in the end, it results in throwing people literally out onto the street. And it is basically a moral anathema. If somebody wants to put their hard-earned money into building a new housing unit and rent it out, it's really not for us to say, and your return is going to be so limited that it's going to discourage new people from building new homes, ultimately driving up costs for everybody else, limiting the size of cities and causing undue hardship. And that's why I put in the chat, again, this is a rather older book. There's new research that's come out, and I can maybe get you some of the citations to that if someone were to write me at Pacific Legal. jburling at pacificlegal.org. I can send you some citations to some of the newer research that shows that just rent control isn't working and it is counterproductive. So I want to, let me turn to some of the possible solutions. Before I do that, I just want to mention one thing. We've been talking a lot about zoning issues and how that impacts. There's a classic book that's just been reissued called Land Use Without Zoning by Professor Bernard Segan. And he compared cities. Oh, Jeremy has the same book. He compared, I have the original book, Jeremy, back in my bookshelf, but the title is so worn off, you can't see it. He compared Houston, which had no zoning, to other nearby cities in Texas, which did have zoning. And he found the only difference in land use patterns was that in Houston, things cost a lot less. That the only real effect of a lot of the zoning was to drive up the costs. And so this book, which is now in the chat, has been just reissued just about a month ago. So it's highly recommended for somebody who really wants to get into the details about zoning and the costs. In addition, I'd recommend you go to the Mercatus Center and look up the stuff that Emily Hamilton has written and other people there as well. A lot of good stuff that it's a really great introduction to market urbanism and the issues. So let's talk about some solutions in the time that we have left. Jeremy, you just spoke, so I'll turn back to Emily. What steps must be taken to ease the crisis? Can you just list some things that we can do rather simply without a major revolution to allow more housing to be built?
Sure, there are plenty of opportunities for reform at the local level. Reforms like reducing minimum lot size requirements that allow, for example, townhouse development to replace existing single family development with a lot more units, allowing apartment buildings to be built in parts of cities that are currently zoned only for commercial uses. And in many cases, we see a lot more commercial vacancy than residential vacancy. So it makes a lot of sense to allow housing to be built on commercial corridors with high vacancy rates. I'd say there's also a very important role for states to step in and set limits on how much their localities can restrict housing development. Localities get their authority to zone from their states. So states are on very solid ground saying, for example, there's going to be a cap on the minimum lot size that a locality can require. Or as we've seen in California, a lot of state level action geared toward requiring localities to allow all of their homeowners to build accessory dwelling units. These can be a backyard cottage or a garage that's turned into an apartment or a basement apartment. And one great thing about accessory dwelling units is they tend to be the politically lowest hanging fruit of land use reform, because so many homeowners can see themselves wanting an accessory dwelling unit, maybe not now, but maybe down the road for an elderly family member or for a short-term rental that they'll get some retirement income from. So there are unfortunately, due to the severity of the situation that we're in right now, there are plenty of opportunities for reform.
And Jeremy, let me ask you, and let me just move off a little bit from market urbanism to maybe some of the other broader reforms that we might have and some of the environmental litigation mills that go on. I mean, I remember recently hearing a statistic that in Marin County, north of San Francisco, there are more cows than there are people because so much of the land is open space. We have areas with 50, 100-acre minimum lot sizes before you can build a home. And then the home has to be necessary for agricultural purposes. And this is an area that is starving for new homes. So Jeremy, what are some of the solutions that you see that could help ease the housing crisis?
Yeah, I would say obviously, where it is possible, the ability to upzone, to remove those barriers that are standing in the way, that are either forcing land to lay idle or making it exceedingly difficult to build. There are quite a bit of green spaces. In fact, there's a very small percentage of California that is actually developed, and quite a bit that is open. And to think that if we open up that development even a little bit, which could build a ton of houses, would just obliterate the open space of California, is really just a myth. There's quite a bit of open space. There's quite a bit of room for reform in even some of these more rural areas where we could allow additional development. And one thing I would just like to say is, what won't solve the problem, or what likely can't solve the problem, in addition to the rent control, and we talked about the problems with that, it's not something that we could simply spend our way out of. The problems with housing costs right now, uh, California would need to spend about 10 billion a year just to get get everyone who is in under the poverty line to be spending less than 50% of their income on housing. So that's not even getting down to the 30% limit, which is already considered burdened, cost burdened by housing. Just to get to that 50% level, the most excessively cost burdened people, we would need to spend 10 billion additional a year. So there's really, that's just not the solution. The
And for how
solution
many years?
is building more.
Yeah. And then what do you end up with is government subsidized housing, government housing projects, which have been a disaster in many areas where they've been tried. We've had people can look up on the internet Pruitt-Igoe, which was a housing complex in St. Louis that turned into an absolute disaster. And you can watch the pictures of the whole place being destroyed by, basically it was imploded because it became unlivable. It was a poorly designed project. It was designed by idealists. And one of the cool things about Pruitt-Igoe is that the elevators only went to every third floor because it would encourage people to walk and meet in the stairways. And what it turned out is that hoodlums took over the stairways. People didn't want to live on the floors that weren't serviced by elevators. They became taken over by further hoodlums, and it turned into an absolute horror show of a place to live from the very idealistic beginnings. If you look at New York City and look at the ability of the housing projects there, of the city to manage them, it has been a humanitarian disaster where you have housing project after housing project with low or no maintenance. Things freeze in the middle of the winter, pipes burst. It's just been a long festering mess, where the better solution is to allow the free market to build new homes. Remove the constraints on building, remove the zoning and environmental restraints. Not that we shouldn't pay attention to the environment, but don't create a mechanism to spend years and years and lawsuits simply trying to get a dozen homes built in an area that is suitable for homes. Don't allow, for example, unions in California sue under the California Environmental Quality Act, saying that unless you use union labor, we're going to sue under some pretext of environmental law. And this has slowed down and made more expensive project after project. So there's much work that needs to be done. And as we have students watching this program this afternoon or morning, wherever you may be watching the recording, Emily, I want to begin with you. What are some of the opportunities that college students who are interested in these sort of issues, what opportunities might they have at places like Mercatus Center?
Yeah, Mercatus has a ton of student opportunities, so I would encourage folks who are interested to check out the student page at mercatus.org. We have several fellowship opportunities, some for undergraduates, some for graduate students in various fields. We have an economics focus, but we have fellowships that are also available to graduate students in other disciplines, both at George Mason University in Virginia, as well as in universities across the country and even around the world. I'm an alum of the Mercatus Center's Master's Fellowship at George Mason, which was a really formative experience for me. So would highly recommend that any students who are interested in those fellowship opportunities to see if there's one that's a good fit for you.
Excellent. And that sounds like the sort of thing I wish were around when I was an undergraduate student, 40s, a long time ago, back in the 70s. Jeremy, let me turn to you. What opportunities do students have at Pacific Legal Foundation?
Yeah, Pacific Legal Foundation, although we are a nonprofit that litigates, we do a lot more than that. We're also involved, we have departments involved in communications and things like that, legislative change. So we actually have quite a few positions that would be available either to current students, interns in our separation of powers practice, for example. We have research positions for recent graduates. And then, of course, for anyone who's interested in going to law school, we almost always are looking for young attorneys who are devoted and interested in these causes. And we regularly are hiring even recent graduates to come in and help litigate these issues. And as you mentioned at the outset, we get to litigate them nationwide. So it can be a very exciting job.
Yeah, I will put in my plug there too. Working with Pacific Legal Foundation is a great opportunity. Any organization of a relatively small size that has had over a dozen cases at the United States Supreme Court in the past few decades, that's a pretty cool track record. And it's given opportunities for people to argue at the Supreme Court, like myself a few years ago, that you wouldn't have in any other law firm. So I recommend that students who are very interested in policy check out the idea of going to law school. This country doesn't have a shortage of good lawyers who are dedicated to free market principles. There may be too many lawyers who are dedicated to other principles, but we certainly need more good lawyers who are willing to fight for liberty and economic freedom we have across the country. So I want to now thank our panelists, Jeremy Talcott from Pacific Legal Foundation and Emily Hamilton from the Mercatus Institute, both fine organizations. And I think this has been a really enjoyable little seminar we've had. And please go on to our various websites, just check out Mercatus Center or search for Pacific Legal Foundation. You can find more about either one of us and the work that these groups are doing to advance housing policy in the United States. Thank you very much.